prep and ensuring that you become a doctor, which is your dream. And so we're really blessed to have an outstanding team of amazing individuals. And if you'd like to ever speak to an academic advisor to get any expertise or any personal guidance regarding your MCAT or your personal statement, your application process, I'm going to just drop a link in here for you. To introduce our amazing panel today, we have Phil Hawkins, our MCAT course director. We have Azaii Calderon-Muniz, our lead cars instructor. We have Molly Hudash, the director of our MCAT content as well as instruction. Nicole Sam, who is our director of admissions, and myself. So we're just going to go through a couple questions that you all posed, and more importantly, anything that you have, please include it in the chat and we're going to work through those, okay? So we're just going to start with our experts, handing it off to everyone.
Hi, but I am I love all the excitement that we saw in the chat. Thank you guys all for coming. Woohoo! Did anyone, out of curiosity, did anyone submit questions to our little Google Drive link, Google form? If not, if there are questions you want answered, we will have times throughout the session where we will open it up to the audience. So we will, we've got a couple questions that had been submitted prior by students who, really wanted answers. We'll go through those, but every once in a while, we'll check in with our chat, right, and see if there's anything that you guys want to know. Amazing. Sweet. So our first question for tonight, right, is an MCAT Science question, right? And the question is, when should I start doing practice questions / how long should I be spending on content? I'll have, but I really feel, what do you think about this?
Yeah, so this is a question that I hear a lot of, just like students who start studying and start getting really bogged down and they feel like they have to master everything before they can move on to the next thing. And that obviously is a little bit of a problem. Ooh, looks like we might be having some audio issues in here. Looks like
everyone?
A lot of people. I was having a little bit of audio issues, so we may need to adjust this. I'm clear. That's because I enunciate. No, that's fine. Yeah. So looking at this question, hopefully, yeah, it was just Molly. All right.
Wait, hold on. Can you guys hear me better now? Or is it still cutting in and out? Yes. Okay.
It's cool. Pretty good.
All right.
Yeah. So generally, whenever I am helping a student with their plan, right? Whatever that looks like, it's really important to break this into phases, right? Like the first chunk is a lot of content review, because if you're reading a passage about insulin and you don't know what insulin is, then you can't really, you can't deal with that. It's not, even if you can do all the data interpretation, if you're missing the content, you can't apply that. And so it's really good to start with content and then transition into doing more practice questions. And I think that eventually you should be doing pretty much all practice questions and then letting those questions tell you what you need to be working on. And so you take an exam, and if I missed a bunch of kidney questions, then I'll go back and look at kidneys again. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First off, like I said, it's good to hit content first before you start applying that. But secondly, and I know this is something that probably a lot of you guys are dealing with right now, that you feel like if you are going so thoroughly that you feel like I can't move to the next topic until I've memorized all of this and I can regurgitate it all from memory, then you're going to move so slow that you're never going to actually reach the end. And that's just a challenge that for most students, this is the first time that's happened in their life. In undergrad, you're very rarely taking a test that you had to study 6 months for, or 4 months for. And that's all of a sudden on the MCAT, that's a little bit more normal. And so it's really important to, as you're studying, realize that you don't have to be able to be a professor of this. You don't need to be able to draw all the steroid hormones from memory. You need to be able to recognize things, not recall them. And there's a difference there. And so What that means is you need to, if they show you a steroid hormone, you should need to be able to like, oh, that kind of looks like a steroid hormone. And that's the level you need to be, because the answers are all in multiple choice. And so that's why when you first start off on content, I encourage students to move a little bit faster, and don't just move on when you feel like you've perfected it. And then as you get into the later portions where you're taking exams, you will start to work on the stuff that is causing you to miss points. And that's the better way to do this. I have like a little bit of a data waning in terms of how I like to do things. And it's just kind of in my life. If you talk to my friends and family, I hate feelings. And I hate doing things because of feelings. And so I think it's really important for students to like, don't go study something because you feel like you're bad at it. Go study something because it's hurting your scores. And so if you just get to the point where you feel okay about most content, then you start taking exams, you might realize, I thought I was really bad at orgo, but I haven't missed a single orgo question. On the other hand, I've missed all of the questions on cardiology, which I thought I was really good at. And so if students just go off feeling, they'll be studying stuff just because they feel like they need to, versus you want to make sure that you're putting in your time and effort on the stuff that's actually going to increase your score. And so the exams and questions, you should be looking at those like diagnostic tools to tell you where your weak areas and how to focus on those. Sorry, I'm getting really passionate, kind of going off on this long spiel. I'm not sure, like, hopefully that kind of answers this question. But looking at this overall, I think that the first probably 1/2 to 2/3 of your time, you want to focus on content review. The last 1/3, practice, and then working on your weak areas. So just at the end of that content review period, that doesn't mean you're done with content. It's just when you move into that like exam and application period, you're only working on the content that the exams are telling you to work on. And that's a much better, more thorough way to work on this, where you're only putting in your time on the stuff that's going to increase your score, not just on stuff that you feel like you need to work on.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I pretty much agree with everything Phil just said. And also, I don't know about you guys, but personally, I don't care. Phil could go off on a tangent for 25 minutes and I'll just sit there like, oh yeah. Right? Is anyone else in the chat just like, yeah, Phil, just honestly, if you just talk for the rest of the 2 hours, I'm good. Yeah. I knew I was not alone there. I'm like, oh my God, amazing. But yeah, I love that you touch on how important it is to try and get the basics of content before you hop into at least a ton of practice. You never want to stray too far from practice materials. That's why we pass question or website and use kind of like strategy as you're doing with content. But like Phil said, data is so important. And honestly, you guys, as someone who was studying for my MCAT, now I teach it, it is incredible how many different reasons there can be that you missed a question, you know? And if you don't know anything about the MCAT and you just hop in and you, let's say, do an entire practice question or practice test, you're trying to review, but each question is a total mystery. Is this a content issue? Was it a strategy issue? Was it a data interpretation issue? Was it an endurance issue and a timing issue? Like, there are so many layers that could influence how you performed on that question or that exam. And it's really hard. And I would say of all of them, content is the easiest box to check. Like, okay, I knew the content, but I really just got exhausted this patch. Graduating level, consider it. So the best so that you can start eliminating possible reasons why you get a question wrong, right? And then, you start working in questions and you say, you know what? I think it's a reading comprehension thing. I think I'm comfortable with insulin, like Phil said, right? I think it's my ability to just stay focused, right? And then you get to be more specific and you really get to hone in on your issues, like Phil was saying. So I think that is so important, right? And just one little side note, you guys, because there are so many reasons that there are to miss a question, I hope no one in the audience right now has basically got a question wrong and just said, oh my God, okay, well, I'll never be good at enzymes. right? Like I just studied enzymes and I got this question wrong anyways. I'm just never going to learn. It's beyond me, right? I'll never do it, right? Or physics, but so many different layers, so many different reasons where things can go wrong. And you really got to peel back those layers and identify, I did 9 out of 10 things right. It was a simple calculation issue. I will learn enzymes. I will learn fluids. I just have to work on the calculations, right? So peeling back the layers when you start to do practice can be a huge superpower when you start to get into that phase.
Yeah, something that I always say, and people are probably tired of hearing it, is just that a weakness is a strength you haven't cultivated yet, right? And so when you identify that weakness and when you identify a place where you can improve, once you've identified it, you can actually have a game plan, right? And do something about it. And a couple of things that I want to add on to this idea of when do we study content, how we study content first. It's not just, so you definitely want to pay attention to what the data is telling you in terms of what your weakest area is or are, but you also want to think about what's high yield. And Phil, I know we talk about this all of the time, because maybe you are getting, 60% on the cardiology section, but you're getting 70% on amino acids. Amino acids are a huge part of the exam. And so you want to actually tackle amino acids first, because cardiology is a much smaller part of the exam. And so that's something else that you should be taking into consideration. The other thing is actually sit down and say, okay, how long has it been since I've seen this content, right? Because if you are years out from having taken, a biochem class, you're probably going to want to spend a little bit more time on biochem. Whereas if you just took it that last semester, chances are you're going to remember that a lot more. And so you might shift gears into focusing on, physics or general chemistry or the biology component. And so there are a lot of things that we encourage students to take into account when they're deciding, okay, when and for how long am I doing content and what content am I prioritizing? And so one thing that I personally like to do is I like to actually write things out. And so I like to say, okay, when am I going to work on this? What are my goals? What are my targets? And so having an idea and actually writing down, I'm going to hit amino acids first, and then I'm going to hit cardiology, having that in a list form can be really helpful, because sometimes, we've been studying for a week, 2 weeks, a month, and we forget what we were planning on focusing on. And so having that in a single location that you can reference as needed can also be super helpful, just for keeping track of things.
Yeah, I feel like there's a couple of things that you guys hit on that I got super excited about for a moment. One is kind of keeping track of where you are and where you're going. That's a really important thing. And I know that Lucia, you're kind of talking about you feel at a loss of how to improve and how to work on that. I think that very often students will get really discouraged, right? Because they put in a lot of time studying and they don't see their scores immediately improving. And I think that there's some really weird stuff that the MCAT does that is different than a lot of other tests, where the MCAT likes to combine different topics and combine different stuff like capacitors and neurons. Here's a question that requires both of those. Or you could have a question saying if you have a spring of a certain weight and you stretch it and then you let go and it went flying, how far would it go? In order to answer that question, you need to know the energy stored in springs. You need to know how to convert that to kinetic energy to find the velocity. And you need to be able to do projectile motions. There's 3 big things you need to work on. Now, if you didn't know any of those things, you're not going to get that question. If you studied for 3 weeks and you really understand 2 of those things, you're still not going to get the question because you need all 3 to kind of put together. So a lot of times as students are studying at first, they aren't seeing I studied and I'm not immediately improving. You are still getting better though, right? You needed 3 things to answer that question. You didn't know any. Now you know 2 of those things. And so you don't get partial credit for stuff on the MCAT, but in my book, you should get partial credit because 60% of what you need to know and you didn't know any of that before. So you are improving even if your score isn't. So a lot of times students will see scores kind of go up a little bit or plateau. And there's just a couple of things, and figuring those out will lead to a all of a sudden jump, right? Like you're getting those last little pieces and sliding those in, and all of a sudden, okay, everything is starting to mesh together. But that also leads to what you were saying, Molly, where like students all have different areas. Like I could have 3 students all miss the same question. And let's make it super narrow of like, this is an electrostatics question that's a calculation. Student 1 didn't know their equations. Student 2 knew their equations, but didn't know which one to use. And then student 3 had a math error. Like all 3 of those students missed the same question, but they all had different problems. And so they should all be doing slightly different things to work on that. Student 1 who didn't know their equations needs to learn their equations. Like flashcards can be useful for that. Might be one of the better ways to go at it. The students who know their equations, but didn't know that they were supposed to use this one, like they need to do a lot of practice questions so they can figure out, oh, with this sort of question, this is how I tackle it. With this sort of question, do something different. For example, like if you're trying to find the energy of a photon, E equals HF. If you're trying to figure out the energy in used by a light bulb, then you want to use like power or circuits. And like there's both light involved in both of those, but like E equals HF is the energy of one photon. And so you can't use that to look at what's going on with a light bulb because you don't know how many photons there are. But like that third student who like is struggling with math stuff, they need like a math refresher. They need to go through and kind of like train on that. And so those are 3 students that all miss the same question, but they all need to do different things. And that's why I really, really believe in this like diagnosing, right? Is that last like 1/2 to 1/3 of your prep where you're finding your weak areas and you're figuring out what to do with it, right? And like just figuring out, hey, I'm missing a bunch of circuits questions or a bunch of electrostatics questions kind of isn't enough. You want to figure out, why was I missing it? Was it content? Was it application? There's a lot of students that just memorize all the equations and then they miss questions and they're like, oh, I need to review equations again. I'm like, no, it's more about application. I use this analogy sometimes. It's like, there's a lot of students that memorize all the equations and it's like they inherited like a mechanics shop and they've memorized all the tools, right? Like there's a crescent wrench and an Allen wrench and a pipe wrench and a monkey wrench. And then somebody comes in and they're like, my car is making this weird noise, like duk, duk, duk. Like, what do I need to do with it? And you're just like, pipe wrench. Does that help? So like just memorizing the equations isn't going to help you know when to use them. And so that's something that's a little bit tricky. I do notice, Noor, you're asking like, how do we keep track of what we're getting wrong and find a pattern in that? If you're in the course, and Noor, I know you are, the lecture towards the end of the course about how to move forward, right? I spent a lot of time kind of diving into how to analyze stuff. There's like a shorter, kind of slightly different version of that like doesn't have as much detail in the podcast that Azaii and I do. I think it's how to review exams. You can find that on Spotify or YouTube or any place that has podcasts. And so, yeah, so that's something that, has some more thorough advice on that stuff, like how to track what's going on with these. I think it's really important to be asking yourself, like, what did I get wrong? And like, even if you got a question correct, right? Like, what was I thinking with this question? And what should I have been thinking, right? Because sometimes students will get the correct answer and they weren't really thinking along the correct lines. Like if they, in the passage, give you a bunch of information about blood, and then they ask you, what's the density of blood? Like, you could like use all the information in the passage and the buoyancy and all of that and calculate it. And that might be what the AMC wants you to do. But there might be some students out there that are just like, well, blood's pretty much just water, and I know the density of water, so I'm going to pick C is correct. And like they're still getting the point, but they're maybe not thinking the way that the MCAT writers want them to think. And I think that is still worth putting in time. So it's important to not just review the stuff that you're missing, but focus on even the stuff that you're getting. Are you thinking along the correct lines for how you should be tackling that?
Yeah, and we talk a lot about this just in general. And it's that the way that you study for CARS and the way that you study for the MCAT in general can be really helpful once you're in medical school, because you need to be able to understand how the test writers are thinking. You need to be able to make those connections. It's not just about content and regurgitating that content, but actually applying it and considering how different content pieces come together. You also, this idea of metacognition, right? Thinking about how we're thinking is really important. And one thing that, you're talking about, Phil, reviewing correct answers, I still have to do every single time. And yes, it means that it takes me longer to review my practice exams, but I'm getting more out of it, especially, when you're studying for the MCAT. It's such a long exam. You've been doing it all day. When you review it 2 days later, you might not remember that you guessed on a question that you got correct. And so sitting down and clicking through every single question is going to be more helpful than just reviewing the ones that you got incorrect. Mm-hmm. And so that's something else that you want to keep in mind as you're doing your review. For students that are in the course, in the CARS course, we have a way for you guys to keep track of why you're missing questions. So make sure that you keep track of that. And if you have any questions about where that is, let me know. But in Lecture 4, we have some components of how to keep track and how to think about why you're missing questions. But I think a lot of people, also prefer virtual ones. And so you can also make your own, keeping in mind, and I know we've talked about this before, but being as specific as possible as to why you're missing questions. And so for CARS, that might mean something like out of scope is not enough. Right. And so, Phil, I know we talked about this in the podcast, so students might be a little tired of hearing this, but you want to think about, okay, am I choosing out of scope answer choices versus am I eliminating something as out of scope first? Those are two very different problems. So the way you tackle them are very different. And, you might miss a question for multiple reasons in the sciences. And so keeping track of both reasons that you missed that question is going to be more helpful than just identifying one. And so those are small things to keep in mind as you're going through. And collecting that data on yourself, Molly, it really is the key to improving.
Yes, I love it, you guys. Yeah, and just like Azaii is saying, there's so many reasons. Well, we've all been saying, right? There's so many reasons you could get something wrong. You really want to be keeping track as you do practice and as you review, right? Is there, maybe I got it right, but did I guess, right? Another really good during not just how was I supposed to be thinking of it, but like Phil mentioned, is there any other way that I could have gotten to this answer? And that's a great question to ask yourself, even if you got it right? Maybe you're asking yourself, okay, cool, I got it right. What did I do on this question that helped me get it right? And how can I take what I did that was successful and apply that to these other subjects that I'm really struggling, right? So that's one thing, but also, cool, I got it right. Was there a shortcut that I could have used to get it right faster or to get it right within a different school of thought, right? So ultimately, I think we all say it all the time, the review is the most important part of your MCAT prep. Peel back every single layer you physically can, you guys. That's what makes the difference between a 505 and a 515 and a 525, right? It's how intentional are you in you. May have practiced perfect, and you're like, oh, cool. Jack Westin has 9,000 questions in their Q bank. Like, let me just go and do all 9,000 and I'll get a 528, right? It's not like that, right? We got to really be thorough. And honestly, I know Phil feels the same. I would rather have you guys do fewer questions and spend a week reviewing them, like one exam, review it for a week. If that really helps you unpack the AMC's perspective and what they want you to say or what they want you to be thinking, go for it. If it takes you however long, go for it, because that, understanding the test writer, that is the way that you see some significant score improvements, right? It's strategy. It's not just all content, which is super important. Azai's feeling the same. Love it. Well, you guys, I think we answered this question pretty thoroughly. Coming back to the initial one, right?
Sure hope so.
We just one word. Guys, that. I think we can go ahead and move on. Maybe I saw some questions up above about admissions, right? And, okay, great. I'll do the MCAT. I'll study hard. That might be a good place to go next.
We want to talk admissions next, because I know there's an admissions question as well. And like Nicole, we've kind of overran you. Nicole just hopped into the session. If you guys don't know Nicole, she is the head of the admissions department. Does a lot of stuff helping students get into med school.
Thank you. Appreciate that introduction, Phil, and thank you all for being here tonight. I see a lot of names that we see in our admissions live sessions, and I just want to take this question as a chance to first give you all a little bit of an introduction in terms of the different applications that are out there, and then we can dive into, the application opening dates. So looking at when applications open for the 2023 application cycle, 2023-2024, there are three main application systems within the United States. So if you are applying to medical schools in the US, you will apply via AMCAS, AACOMAS, or TMD-SAS. AMCAS will be for MD schools within the US, primarily outside of Texas. So the name of that abbreviation would be the American Medical College Application Service. So you will see a lot if you're applying to MD schools in the US. Again, aside from Texas, there are 2 schools in Texas that are part of it, but overall that's going to be the service for MD schools. Then we will have AACOMAS, which is the system for DO schools in the US, outside of Texas primarily. And that's going to be the American Association of Colleges of Osteopathic Medicine Application Service. So if you're applying DO school, you will realistically be applying through that system. And then lastly, we'll also have the Texas schools. Again, DSS, which stands for the Texas Medical and Dental Schools Application Service. So if students are applying through Texas, that's the system you're going to look. Now, in terms of when they open, all these application systems will open in May. The exact date in May will vary each year, but around May 3rd, you should have access to start working on all 3 applications. When it comes to AACOMAS, the DO application, once the application opens, it's also eligible for submission. So you'll be able to submit May for that. When we begin looking at TMD-SAS, the Texas schools, that will open early May. And usually around the middle of May is when you'll be able to begin submitting the application. So around May 17th or so, plus or minus a few days. And then AMCAS being the application for the US MD schools outside of Texas, that will get really around May 3rd, a couple days plus or minus, is available for working on the application. And at the end of the month is when you will be able to submit, usually around May 31st. So with these applications, that is when they will open. They start in May for you to be able to then apply to begin at the university for 2024. So you're applying a little bit more than a year in advance. In terms of when you should start working on your application, all of you that are here tonight are on top of it, because all of you are started on the application in a really good time span. So good job being here, because you're now ahead of the game by able to get started with your personal statement. We usually suggest all of you getting started with the personal statement as early as possible, because it gives you the time to be able to go through several drafts to be able to really perfect what you want, especially if you're still in school, you're studying MCAT at the same time, you have personal obligations, life moves on, and it can get really hard to dedicate the time to be able to work through your personal statement. So the sooner you get started with it, the better, so that, again, you have the time to go through drafts to perfect it. Now, that's not to say that we haven't helped students get to that point of achieving a personal statement in a few weeks. Absolutely seen students do that. And if you're a student that really needs to focus on the MCAT for a few months before you're ready to dive into the personal statement, by all means, you can absolutely take that approach. because that MCAT score, as many of you know, is going to be a door opener to getting into school. So it's going to hold huge weight to then allow schools to review your personal statement and really give you that full chance. So of course, MCAT has significant weight, but the sooner you can start with your personal statement, the better. You'll also have your activities, which will take a lot of time to because they're very significant explanations where you are describing the different experiences that you've partaken in. So the sooner you start with the process, the sooner you'll be able to get through that. But again, we know that the MCAT is a really strenuous process. So if you need a little bit more time to dedicate to that and establish a schedule for starting with the app a little later, there is flexibility. But note that your goal is to submit in May or as close to May as possible. I know that earlier there was a question, I believe, from Christelle regarding the application process and every students with amazing stats and experiences not getting into med school and how you can stand out. One way to get there is by submitting in a manner. So every year we see students with really great stats and really great applications overall submitting way later, which it's a challenge in the cycle. So the sooner you submit, the better. Keep in mind that May date as a goal for when you're really diving into the application and hopefully getting started. And the sooner that you're able to submit, the better. In terms of what you can do to really stand out as an applicant, that is where the written components in your application are going to be huge. So we know you have great stats. We know you have great experiences. The way you convey them and talk about them is what will let you stand out significantly over others. And that's why I always tell our students, share your stories. As you're going through your experiences, note different patients you're working with. Note different physicians that you've worked with. If you're in a research lab, write about different skills you've gained, and maybe even a story that shows your leadership skills, that shows how you've overcome a challenge, so that these are things that you can include in your application to allow the medical school to see your skills come to life and to see your personality come into the of why you will be a good physician at the end of the day. In terms of the length of the personal statement, it's a little short, 5,300 characters, which if it's single spaced, that's only one page. So there's not that much space to talk about it. And that's where you want to be really smart with the stories that you're using. Each story should share something else about you that will add an extra layer about why you're going to be a good physician. And I know in life, it's really easy to stray away from getting personal and just keeping things on the surface level. The personal statement is a chance to do just that. Get personal. Don't be afraid to share what's behind the scenes of your field, of why you're pursuing a career in medicine, because that's how they really, really get to know who you are and what the path is for you. In terms of the window to submit the application, you can technically submit all the way through October. Again, the sooner you can get started, the better you're going to be your chances of being able to through the application, so that you can have a stronger turnaround since the application process is rolling. And each days that you go sooner will allow you to be a potential candidate for an interview sooner in the cycle. In terms of someone was going to jump in.
Oh, there's a lot of really good info here. And it's just super exciting. I do think starting early, I can't overemphasize that. Nicole is a hero with helping students just kind of get in. There's so many students that hold off on the personal statement until they finish the MCAT. And it's kind of just like a secondary thought. And they know that they should be early, and you should, but don't push your MCAT until the beginning of May and then be like, oh, I need to write my personal statement in 2 weeks. You should probably be working on your personal statement now if you want to apply in this cycle. And I know there were several questions kind of about personal statements. Armani, I know you have the 5 drafts. Yeah, you are following my advice. And I know, Christian, you said something earlier about how do you start writing? And so Armani might, I know he watched the podcast on this, but I really want to encourage students to just write about anything that you think might be interesting first. And don't try to write a personal statement. Just write interesting stuff about you. And then you might notice that things pop out of that. And there might be trends and like things that come out of this. And so I know I've talked about this several times, but my personal statement that I wrote that got me into med school, I wrote one about like my house burned down when I was younger. And I wrote one about like living on a farm and like I had a friend who was a cow. And I wrote one about like spending a lot of time in a nursing home because my mom was a nurse. And so every day after school, I'd hang out there. And like what ended up being my personal statement had all of those things in that personal statement. And my personal statement, I didn't realize it when I was writing those things, but it was all about loss. And so like losing my house in a fire and losing friends that I had made in like the nursing home, and then like raising cattle to butcher, to like feed the family and things like that. And so I would just start writing first off, and don't try to write the perfect personal statement. Just try to write anything that you think might be interesting. I've seen personal statements about chess. I've seen personal statements about soccer. And like, honestly, those stick with me a whole lot better than the personal statements about just like, I worked really hard and I'll be a great doctor and please let me be a doctor. And like that, like I would rather hear about, the time you wrecked on a bike or something like that, because that's more engaging and interesting. And so just kind of start with that would be my advice. And then it sounds like, Armani, you're doing this, but like give your like those things to other people and see like what parts of these do you like? Do you like one of these better than the others? Do you like a part of this? And I think that's a really good way to start, whereas just like get some interesting stuff. And you have the bonus of if there's something you don't use, you can use that for secondaries maybe. And like having extra stuff written and like, oh, I can utilize that for something else can be super useful. But that also kind of went back to the question about like, why do people with great stats not get in? Because they didn't put an effort on their personal statement, or they like bombed their interviews. And there's a lot of other stuff going on where you need to be like a good person, not just be a good person, but you need to talk to like medical school admission committees and be a person, period, where they are like, oh, this is somebody I want to interact with. I don't mind sharing this, but I did not do well with my first interviews. The first 5 places I interviewed, I didn't get into any of them. The last 5 places I interviewed, I got into all of them. And that's just because I got better at interviews as I went through this. And so I didn't practice interviews. I totally should have. And luckily I got more than 5 interviews, because otherwise I wouldn't have gotten in anywhere. And I know, Nicole, you do a lot of stuff with that. And that's why just quick pitch for the admissions department. Like every year, only about 40% of students who apply for the MCAT get in. And the ones that work with Nicole in the admissions department, I think it's 94% get in, which is huge. And a lot of that comes down to preparing properly for your personal statements, your interviews, your secondaries, and developing those skills and getting more eyes on that stuff and practice. And it's just, I think it's something that a lot of students neglect. As much as I talk about the MCAT and Azaii and Molly, I know you're on board with me with this. Like I talk about MCAT all the time, but I think students often get kind of sucked into the MCAT and don't think about what comes after that. And that's also a really critical thing.
Yeah. And just going back to the main prompt here, I think that is where so much of that emphasis comes up with preparing for the MCAT, making sure you have a good MCAT score. And then as Christelle said, sometimes those stats come really, really, really high, but we haven't had time to focus on the rest of the application because the emphasis was on the MCAT. So yeah, make sure you get started with the application now so that we're able to put in the time. And I know that there were some questions related to the prompt or the personal statement itself. That's going to go out to every single medical school that you apply to within that application system. So all schools are going to get that same essay, and you're basically writing about why you want to be a physician. Students think about it differently depending on the angle that kind of serves them best, but it's really either why medicine, or why do you want to be a physician, or why will you be a good fit for medical school? What are the different perceptions that you want to have for this question? And then once you get into secondaries is when the questions will be a little bit specific for different schools. I don't want to dive in too much into that process, but I know some students had asked about secondaries overall in the chat. And one thing I want to identify is one of the students brought up specifically a question about like anything else in the application that's not in the application that you want to share. And keep in mind, there are things about you that have gotten you to where you are today that you may overlook initially. And usually this is a really good opportunity to be able to share it. So think about this question as an opportunity on one end to share any pitfalls in your application. If you had a lower section on your MCAT and there's an explanation, grade one semester, use that as an opportunity to make an explanation. But let's say there's like a hobby that's really defined who you are over the years and really part in your life growing up, or like even something about your childhood that stood out to you. These are all things that can make you an exceptional applicant and allow, again, the committee to see who you are as a person. And never forget that. Of course, the stats are a big part of it. Of course, they want to know that academically you can handle it, but they also want to know that as a person, you have those communication skills, you have the ability to handle other individuals, and that's where all the written portions in the application will come in and stand out. I know
I am not an expert. I want to just throw in one little plug, you guys, for getting started on your personal statement early. When you are focused so much on the MCAT and you're just constantly studying, you're constantly doing practice questions and you're evaluating your performance, it almost in a way sometimes can condition you like, I am the number, I am the score that I am, like I am the progress that I've made. And getting started on your personal statement, even if it's not personal statement, it's 1 hour every week. Sit down and just free write. What matters to you? Why do you want to be a doctor? This was something that I to into when I'm writing for MCAT. Honestly, it helped remind me of what I wanted in my life and why I was studying. So if you are someone who struggles with motivation or is struggling with just the stress of preparing for your MCAT, don't treat the personal statement as this is another huge, scary obstacle I need to face. Treat it as this is my opportunity to check in with myself and to humanize myself and to explore the things that have happened in my life that have put me on this path. It's your why, like your work, your activities, those are amazing. It's describing what you've done, but it's who you are and checking in with yourself periodically. Why am I here? Why do I want to dedicate hours and hours and hours to study for this test? Why does it matter to me? For me, at least, that was something that was really a special part of my MCAT journey. So yeah, don't need to write easily, but it can be a motivating experience as well, and it can actually help you get through your MCAT prep. So that's just my 2 cents. Definitely get started, right? Even if it's just a free write every once in a while, just to get your mind moving on things that matter to you. Something that can really, really help.
Exactly. And also remembering your why throughout the process can also keep you motivated with the MCAT. It easily, become discouraging at times. There may be one section that you're stuck on, but going through that development of why you're here can always serve as a reminder that can even push you harder to do well on the MCAT and bring out those strengths. So use it as more just a personal statement. It's a motivator to keep you going in life and throughout your whole MCAT and pre-med journey.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, to be said about when you're writing your personal statement, it's you on paper. And so when medical schools, they look at that, it's not just whether you will make a good physician, it's whether you'll be a good fit at their school. Remember that they're investing in you, right? That's a spot that someone else can have. And so what makes you a good fit for their school? And that's something that interviews also do, right? But this is your first chance to show them that. And I saw a couple of people asking in the chat, how do we make it not just another experiences section? And so one thing that I like to say is start that early too. Start kind of thinking about, okay, what kinds of things do I want to have in my experience section in terms of quality, not quantity? And then make sure that, your personal statement's not a regurgitation of that. Something that, we've mentioned before is when you're send your, your drafts to other people to read, but it's not just people that know you, because the people that know you, they have inside information that med schools will not have when they're reading your personal statement. And so I've talked about this, but I sent my personal statement to people that I didn't know. So I had my family's coworkers read them and come back and tell them and tell me, okay, what did I get from that? Who is this person? And so that can be super helpful as well, because again, it's really about you on paper. And so that's something to consider when you're working through this. And so making sure that when you're writing your personal statement, it's okay to also go back and you have multiple drafts. Go back and maybe just rewrite one of them. You're going to come in with a different perspective. And like Molly, you were saying, having a scheduled time to go through it can be really helpful. But also, for example, thinking about when you're going back and reviewing it. You may not want to do that during finals week, right? But also just considering when you have those breaks, when you've done something that you found interesting, right? When you have those really great moments of engagement with other people that inspire you, write those down and have that kind of collection to be able to fall back to. There really is such a great opportunity with personal statements, with secondaries, and just kind of thinking about, okay, what do I want to convey as to why I would fit into any medical school? And then your secondaries, I'm going to tell you why I will fit into your medical school. And one of the best pieces of advice that I got for interviewing was from a medical student who actually was here as well. And they said, it's not just the schools interviewing you. You are interviewing the schools. And you want to ask yourself, is this a place where I want to spend the next 4+ years of my life, right? Because if you're getting any other degree at the time, or, you extend it for any reason, you want to make sure that you're going to be supported, that the people that are next to you interviewing are people you would want to study with. And so there was one school that I applied to that I interviewed to, and I ended up getting into it. But because of the people I was interviewing with, I said no right off the bat before I had even heard back from the school, because the people that I was interviewing with only cared about the numbers, and they were asking each other their GPA and their MCAT scores. It was really cutthroat. And I thought to myself, I was like, if this med school can't but if they can't screen their applicants in a way that is more holistic, something's off here, right? And it's not going to be a good fit for me as a person. And so think about it as in that capacity as well. And when you're writing your personal statement, because that can be really freeing. And so that can be something that takes that pressure, that load off, and allows you to embrace and lean into your creativity.
I agree. And just kind of like going off of that, like you really need to be true to you in that, which I know we've talked about before lots of times, but there's a lot of students that feel like they shouldn't talk about something bad, like something, or even not even necessarily bad, but just something that doesn't seem like the prototypical idea of a doctor, right? Where people are afraid to talk about, oh, I love video games, right? Or something like that. And that is like, I don't know if I definitely don't agree with that, but even if you've had struggles, right? Don't be afraid to talk about that. Med schools are trying to figure out who's going to be a great physician and who they should kind of go through this. And I want you to kind of imagine that you had, like, this is a horrible thing for me to tell you, but imagine that you had cancer, right? And you went and talked to like your oncologist, right? Do you want your doctor to be the person that everything was perfect and they never had any problems ever in their life? Or would you rather have, like in this time where you're struggling, would you rather have a doctor who has struggled at times and like knows what it's like to have things not go right sometimes? And like, I know, like for me as a person, I want a physician that understands like maybe what I'm going through, or understands like something from a patient's perspective. And so like, and med schools know this, right? They want, like, cause that leads to empathy, right? If you have had problems and you've overcome them, or you've had issues that you've helped other people overcome, like that is not a bad thing, right? That's a good thing. And you should be proud of that. And so don't be afraid to talk about things like, like really struggling with English, like as a second language in like high school and into college. Don't be afraid to talk about, like, maybe your parents have there's alcoholism in your family or something like that. So don't be afraid to like actually be personal. I know that we've talked about this, but there's a reason it's the personal statement. You want to explain who you are as a person so that you can figure out like if that's going to be a good fit for you.
Yeah, definitely. And just to piggyback off of what Phil said, like a lot of those more challenging experiences or experiences that may not always shed this positive light are what got you to pursue this path. And a lot of people are you're today. It comes into really thinking about experiences in life. How do you develop who you are? And a lot of times it is those more challenging experiences that got that to happen. And again, as Phil shared, it's a chance to get personal. Don't shy away from sharing those things because that's a part of you. You're human. And not everything in life always goes well. People face challenges the same way your patients will. And being able to address that oftentimes shows your relatability and your understanding that things can come up, and yet it's your perspective and how you're able to tackle it that can create additional opportunities for you. We had a student that was actually living out of their car in the past, and they were able to take that struggle as an opportunity to push them to, on one end, get the services they needed from community opportunities around them, but from the other end, if they were in a position of receiving housing, giving back to the community and getting involved in AmeriCorps where they were serving underserved populations and giving resources to them in whatever way they can, and also allowed them an opportunity to get involved with a homeless shelter and food banks. So that experience that they went through ultimately made them more altruistic as well and made them want to give back to the community and those that they went through. So keep in mind that, again, what you've been through defines who you are and really shows how you're going to be a stronger person, a better person, and an individual that's going to be able to help others in the future. So give yourself the credit that you deserve. And that was a great moment too. He was a great student.
Yeah. So I know, Azaii, you said somebody asked you a question about like Harvard. So like maybe we should talk a little bit about that, like just kind of med school experience, because I feel like a lot of students are interested in that. I thought it was funny. You said I was applying to a school and they were a little too competitive and focused on scores, so I decided not to go there. And like you're actually at Harvard, so like the other place was the numbers place, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a personal kind of story, but my late uncle helped me learn math starting in elementary and then middle school, and he used to tell me, "You're smart enough to get into Harvard," and I would respond, "I wouldn't go there if they paid me." And in part, it was because of this idea that I had of it being cutthroat and, people that I wouldn't fit in with for a lot of reasons. And then I ended up applying to HMS, not because I wanted to, not because I thought I would get in. I genuinely did not believe that I would get in. My pre-med advisor was not supportive of me applying and recommended against me applying to any kind of just kind of like more well-known medical schools until she saw my MCAT score. And then it was a 180. And someone who had known me for a couple of years, who actually is an advisor at another medical school, told me, I will read your personal statement, apply to these schools. And I was just kind of like, I'm not going to get in. And she was just trust me. And when I came to interview, Phil, you've heard this story. I took a picture with myself in it with the HMS as the backdrop, because I was like, people are just going to think that I took this picture off of the internet. And when I came back for revisit, I met some really incredible people who I'm still friends with and who have been my rocks, so to speak, in medical school. And the environment is actually really supportive. And in terms of other students, there's this constant coming together, and we would sit together and study and review together. We would share notes. And I think because we knew that it was about being good physicians, it wasn't about, and it isn't about being better than the person next to you. Because at the end of the day, the person next to you might be your doctor, right? And so one of you guys might end up taking care of me one day in some capacity or another. And so I want to make sure that you are going to be, as great of a physician as you can be. In terms of more academic support. So my academic advisor is one of those people that will, if you let her know that you need something done, she is on it. She's just like, okay, let's get the moving parts. When I got sick and right before I had to take my medical leave of absence, she connected me with doctors that she knew. And she was like, okay, we need to, get her to be seen. And then at the hospital site that I was at for my primary clinical year, I struggled. Being very frank, I considered dropping out of medical school. It was just incredibly overwhelming. I had so much going on personally. I had a lot going on at the hospital, and I didn't have a choice but to rely on the individuals who were in charge of the program. And everyone's going to have ups, everyone's going to have downs, right? And so no place is perfect. And that means HMS is far from perfect as well. But my friends got me through it. And so that's where revisit and interview process, were so important, and were important for me. And you want to make sure that where you go, you're going to be supported holistically, not just in one capacity or another. And yeah, I would love to hear from Seyda as well, because we haven't heard from you and you have so many great things to say and we love you. So I'm going to hand off for this.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have such an amazing panel here tonight, and I'm sure everyone is enjoying it. Can I hear from the chat? How are we doing? How is everyone doing in our live session today? Oh, I love it, Jessica. Noor, oh my goodness. Christian, you love it as well? Dima, okay, I like that. Let's see. I know there's 54 people in here aside from our amazing team, so I need to hear it from everyone. Say thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, I love it. Everyone finds it very motivational. Everyone's getting a lot out of this session. This is such great feedback. So as an advisor, right, we have a lot of students from such diverse backgrounds, and it's really important to be considerate because some of us are traditional pre-med students, right? We're going full-time school and simultaneously studying for the MCAT. Sometimes you're working full-time and you have a baby, or maybe you have so many different obligations because you are such a caring, selfless, altruistic individual, and that's why you pursue this profession in the first place. So whatever the case may be, does anyone have any questions regarding setting up a study plan, accountability, commitment for the MCAT? Let's see. I just want to hear from you all. What are you struggling with when it comes to dedicating time for your MCAT? And we have such an amazing panel here tonight, so I just want to hear, we can have their input regarding this as well.
Yeah, I just typed it into the chat, but I recently wrote about this, and it was not just myself not having that support, but a lot of my friends who were also applying to medical school in that same year not having that support and feeling like their advisors didn't see them. And to be quite frank, it was a lot of people from minority backgrounds, not just racially and ethnically, but also financially. And so it kind of became this thing of us supporting each other. And one thing that I have learned over the years to ask myself, because I'm someone that can have a lot of self-doubt. And Phil, we've talked about how you tend to be more overconfident and I tend to be less confident and erring on the side of that. But asking yourself, okay, you have people that enjoy being around you in your life, that choose to stay in your life. Why? Your academic advisors don't know the full you. And so there are people who do know more of the full you, and that can be a source of support. And of course, the academic advisors are here as well. That's why they get paid to talk with you and to be there to support you. But just thinking about that and looking at your strengths, not just academically, but what makes you someone that other people want to be around. And you might be someone that has a closer group of friends instead of a bigger group of friends. I'm definitely someone who keeps to fewer people just because I invest so much in the people in my life. But, maybe ask them. Don't be afraid to ask the people in your life and let them know that, hey, I'm not feeling supported in this realm. I'd love to hear why, you are here for me.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Azaii, for that. We truly have an amazing team of experts who are here to listen to your personal journey, because I just hate when we start to compare our insides with other people's outsides. You don't know what it took them to get there. You don't know what their personal study plan was. You don't know how much one-on-one support they had. And so definitely, I dropped that link for our advisors. Speak to someone who's going to listen to you and come in there with so much compassion and non-judgmental opinions, right? Like, these are very objective, realistic goals that we set for our students, because we have this question a lot here, right? While for working full-time or either maybe you're going to school full-time. So I just want to jump into some really easy numbers. There's a really rough ballpark regarding how much time you need to dedicate towards your MCAT. It really does vary per student, because your background is going to greatly determine how much time you're going to need. And so assuming that you've taken all your pre-med classes, you've gotten a great foundation with the content, we're looking at a ballpark of around 300 hours. And so if you're working full time, this is roughly looking like an 18 hours a week schedule, just purely for your MCAT, whether that be going over the content, doing practice problems, watching some lectures, really hitting full lengths when appropriate. You're going to look to aim for 18 hours a week for about 4 to 5, 6 months. And that's a really rough estimate, again, because we don't necessarily know exactly what your background is. But again, speak to one of our advisors. They'll definitely give you more personalized guidance regarding that. In addition to that, how much time do you need to really dedicate towards your MCAT, right? So this is going to be, again, really personal, but we do say that rough 300 to 350 hours, depending on your progress. So I'm going to jump into a couple of questions from the chat, just because I know we have so many great questions, and keeping up with school as well as really studying for the MCAT. This is a really great one, Dima. Really, this is going to, we want to ensure that you have a really great study plan, because if you're doing things that aren't going to be tested, that aren't high yield, or maybe you're just spending too much time on content, you're not studying effectively. And so this really does come into play when you're determining a good study plan. But let's say ideally we do have students from our course too, so I'm just going to really tailor it for individuals who have a good study plan that covers everything. Given that, if you study between 18 hours, let's say you're studying 2 to 3 hours a day during the week, and maybe 8 hours during one weekend, one day of the weekend, right? That's a really good balance. And did you want to say something, Phil?
Always. But yeah. No, I'm just agreeing with everything you're saying. Yeah.
Please, if there's anything else that you'd like to add, we'd love to hear your advice too.
No, I agree. Like, that 300 hours is a good kind of ballpark for students. It does definitely depend on the student, though. Like, if you have a biology, chemistry, and physics master's degree, and you have a bachelor's in psychology, you're probably not going to need to study as much. If you've been working full time as a nurse for the past 10 years and you have not been in a classroom at all, then that may also change that. And so, kind of figuring out kind of where you are is definitely a factor, but also where are you going, which is also something to keep in mind. Is your goal, do you want to go to WashU, Mayo, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, or do you want to go to your local, private or your state public medical school? Not that there's anything wrong with those. I actually think that a state medical school is a better choice if you want to be like an internal medicine physician who works in small communities. Like, you're going to get a lot better kind of education for what it is that you want to do in some of those environments. Now, on the other hand, if you want to do research, right, like you want to be focused on like a heavy like research physician oriented track, then you need to go to a research oriented school, or you don't need to, but it's more useful and it makes more sense. And so trying to figure out where you're going, where you're at now, and like both of those things kind of factor into that study plan. I will say I've had students prepare for the exam in 2 months. That is pretty rare. And then I've also had students prepare for the exam in a year and a half. That is also pretty rare. Most students spend between like 3 and 6 months. I'm going to say a lot of students that spend 3 or 4 months. Most of the students I've had that have spent 3 months have said, I wish I had more time. So starting earlier, it's very rare that a student says like, oh, I should have taken it a month ago. I'm fine. That doesn't happen that often. Usually students want a little bit more time. And so that's just kind of like an overall way to look at that.
Yes, Bill, I could not agree more with you, right? Our students are always saying, I wish I had more time, because we want to be mindful, right? We don't want to leave you last minute to take the exam before applications are due. The sooner that we can have you take your test, the better. And so this is where our expert Nicole comes into play, right? And certainly has a lot to do with your application and raising your competitiveness in regards to taking advantage of rolling admissions. And so, in regards to if it's too early for you to start studying for the MCAT Himani, this is a really great question. If you're actually taking the steps to really intentionally plan when to take your exam as a freshman, we have lots of great guidance regarding this. I would definitely suggest meeting with one of our advisors so they can really craft something tailored. However, just to shorthandedly answer your question, as a freshman, you certainly have your sciences, your prereqs to go through. However, given that the CARS section is purely a strategy-based section, right, you certainly want to start that as soon as possible. Azaii, do you want to add anything regarding this?
Asking me about cars is dangerous. So I always have a lot to say about cars. It was not my favorite section when I was studying, believe it or not. I was a Romance language and literature major. So you would think that cars would be a breeze or that I would enjoy cars. No. I found it boring. I thought it was subjective. I was like, why are we even doing this? And it wasn't until I got to and I say this all the time, it wasn't until I got to medical school that I realized it was my first set of true patients, because there is so much in cars that you apply, and honestly, not just to patients, but to how you think, to how you reason. It has so much connection with the sciences. It's about learning how test writers write and learning to listen to other people and hold back your own biases, hold back your own opinion on a matter, and really look at the data that's in front of you, and the stories that are in front of you. And so to think about this question about why someone's CARS score might not be changing or how to improve. First, if it's at a time where you're starting to study for CARS, come to the free trial sessions. We talk about this. And the way you see me now is the way I am in person and the way I am in the sessions. But it really is about changing how we think and thinking about, the CARS section, really coming back to that idea of metacognition, thinking about how we think, really understanding, where am I going wrong and what can I improve on? And again, coming back to that same idea of a weakness is just a strength you haven't cultivated yet. And so for CARS, if your score isn't changing, and if you're starting at kind of that mid score of a 125, you need to come back to the basics. Is it that you are struggling with reading comprehension? Very, very rarely is it true that a student with a 125, their primary struggle is timing. That is not what you are struggling with. You are struggling with something, more basic, with accuracy. And that's something that we prioritize in the course and that we talk about in the free trial session. You should be starting with accuracy. And that means understanding what you're reading. And this can feel like a very surface level thing, but this is where a lot of students have difficulty, and learning to recognize and take at face value what the author cares about, right? And then from there, you can move on to questions. And so like we talked about earlier, when you're trying to figure out what areas need improvement, data is helpful, and keep track. And like I mentioned before, we have that Phil and Molly are like, yes, keep track of why you're missing questions. And again, as granular, as specific as possible, especially for cars. There is no content, and it's all strategy. It's all about how you're thinking. And so that means that it provides a different glimpse into your ability to learn and your ability to adapt for medical schools than the sciences, right? Because the sciences are a combination. You need to be able to learn and understand the material and then apply it. For cars, it's just, how do you think? How do you take what you're given and simply use it? How do you think on the fly, purely on the fly? And so making sure that you're considering not just where you're starting off, but also looking at, okay, am I making progress in one area? And Phil, you've talked, I think we've all talked about it at this point. Am I making progress in an area, but it's not being reflected in the scores because I'm not connecting something, right? So then later on, you're getting better at your reading comprehension, but you're still not applying that to the questions, right? And this comes back to really identifying where you're struggling. And so don't freak out if you're not making immediate progress, because it might just be that you're not at a point where you are connecting the pieces that you need to improve upon. And that actually goes with a lot of other things we've talked about. And so, Nicole, maybe you can chime in on this, but even with your personal statement, it might feel like I'm not really making progress, right? But you can always connect things as you move along. You can do that with the sciences. And there's so much there. Yeah, be gentle with yourself with cars. Cars can be a doozy, which is why often when I ask students, give me one word that you're feeling with respect to cars, my heart breaks a little bit. But now it's my favorite section, which is why I'm here at Jack Westin and why I absolutely love what I do, because it has the potential to prepare you for medical school in a very unique way.
Yeah, cars is super interesting. As somebody who spends a lot of time in the sciences, I think it's really useful for students to sometimes just step back and be like, okay, because if I ever have a student that says I'm doing well in 3 sections but bombing 1, it's cars. That's just pretty much always the case, because cars is just so different than the other sections. And I think that there's a lot of times that students try to tackle cars the same way that they tackle the sciences, and it just doesn't work, right? Because in the sciences, you go in and you have to bring in outside knowledge. Like, you spend months studying content so that you can come in, so that you have arms and weapons, right? Like, got a bandolier filled with equations, right? Going into the sciences. But then you walk into cars and all of a sudden you're naked, right? Like, I got nothing, right? There's nothing I know that's going to be helpful. And that sounds scary, but you don't need anything for cars. Cars on paper sounds like the easiest section, right? Because you don't need to know anything. They give you a passage, the answer's in the passage, pick the answer, right? Like that seems so easy, but you guys are really smart. And so the MCAT writers have to crank up the difficulty to see, to actually try to separate people in there. And so it's remarkably difficult, but I think it's important to understand what they're trying to test. And so to be a great physician, you need to know a lot of things, right? You need to know that glycyrrhizin is in licorice, and it can kill you if you eat too much of it. You need to know you can't have grapefruit if you're on a statin, right? But those aren't really complex ideas. They're just things to know and facts. And that's what the science section is about. Can you memorize a bunch of facts and apply them? But just knowing stuff doesn't make you a great doctor. Otherwise, computers would be the best doctors. It's also really important to understand what's going on in a patient's mind. What are they going through? And that's what the cars section is trying to test. From me personally, I struggled with cars, and it was because I was trying to treat it the same way as the sciences. I would see a question and I would try to approach them like, oh, I think I know something about this. I know something about the Russian oligarchy, or I know something about ballet in Peru. I don't actually know anything about ballet in Peru, but this idea, like I know something about like Darwinian evolution or religion or France, right? And so I was trying to show how smart I was. Like I want to show like I know things, right? And I want to pick an answer. But the whole point of cars is not what do you know, it's do you understand these people, right? And that's the whole point of cars. And it takes a second to make that shift in your brain, because the science is what do you know? And like the cars, if you just approach it from the same perspective, you're gonna struggle, because that's not what they're testing, right? They're testing like, do you understand these people? And so understanding what they're testing is a really big deal. Honestly, this is a big deal just everywhere in life, right? Like if you're interviewing somewhere and they ask you a question, right? Like, what do you do if like you see an employer at work, or your manager tells you to do something that you probably shouldn't do, right? If you know what it is that they're trying to find out, right? If let's say the organization's shady and they want to see, are you gonna like go along? Are you gonna keep your mouth shut, right? And like not tell the police or whatever? Like if you really need that job, then like maybe like the immoral answer is the right answer to that, right? I'm not saying people should be immoral, but understanding what are they trying to test, like that changes what the right answer is. And so with cars, understanding that they're not testing what you know, they're testing, do you understand these people? And that's a different thing that they're trying to test. And so if you try to approach it the same way, it creates problems. I know that is just where I had problems, Azaii, and I know that there are other issues students can have with like reading comprehension, or like they're trying to treat all these questions the same, but they're different kinds of questions about tone or about details or like that sort of thing, or timing or endurance. And so there's a whole lot of problems that students can have, but figuring out what your weakness was or what your weakness is. And so the student here who's trying to talk about like, how do I get from 125 to 132, right? It comes down to data and diagnosing. And this, I don't mean to just make it all about that, but you need to figure out what's wrong before you can fix it. And so there's a lot of different reasons that a student might be at a 125 and plateauing. And so it could be kind of a lot of different things. And so the first step is try to figure out what's going on with that. And that's why office hours is useful, and the workshops and the live sessions and stuff that we do. On top of obviously the free trial sessions. Anybody who's in the course, like you can figure out a lot about like how you're approaching cars by just talking to people who are doing it. That's how you get better at skills. And cars is a skill. Cars is not knowledge. It's a skill. So like if you want to get better at basketball, talk to people who are good at basketball, right? Having a coach who understands basketball is going to make you way better than studying, right? Like if you read LeBron James's biography, that doesn't make you better at basketball. It makes you know more. Basketball is a skill. It's not knowledge. And so you need like training and practice way more for cars. For sciences, you need knowledge. You need some skills too there, but cars is all skill. And so studying doesn't help as much with that.
Yeah. One thing, first of all, this conversation is so fascinating because really there are so many things that are true of cars that are not true of sciences. Mm-hmm. Like it's always such a fantastically interesting conversation to evaluate what aspects of cars can we apply to sciences and what about the opposite, right? And I kind of have my feet in both camps. So those of you guys that are in the course, right, I do a lot of work in the cars sphere, right? You'll see me in cars workshops all the time. I also do a lot with the sciences. So I love this toss up of like, what can we say is similar and how are they different? One thing that Azaii touched on that I absolutely love is how cars asks you to strip away everything that is you and to take something at face value. And honestly, that is a hugely important skill, right? We always talk about how important it is to give culturally competent care, right? You are going to have patients that do not have your same background. They will not have your same thoughts and feelings and opinions, right? They won't have your same experiences. When you sit down with the patient, you need to strip away your biases and take what they're saying as what they're saying, right? And you need to be able to connect with them, even if they're talking about something that you don't understand, right? You can't connect with them at all. And honestly, I think that's kind of what CARS does for you. It asks you, hey, this is important. Pay attention to this thing that you hate, right? Can you suffer through it and make the best of it, or can you not, right? So I actually love that CARS does that. I also think that, for those of us who think very scientifically and very objectively, myself included, there is an element of that you can bring to CARS, right? If you are someone who feels comfortable with formulas and strategies and, step-by-step plans, right? That's exactly what our core strategies actually are, right? The goal there, if you are someone who feels much more comfortable with the right or wrong aspects of the sciences, know that there are ways that you can implement that into CARS, right? And that's something that we work on all the time. Another thing that I love, right? We talk about our live sessions, right? Our workshops. And Phil, you were saying, it's great to get together and hear from other people that are CARS experts. One of the things that I actually love about our workshops is that you don't just hear from Azaii or hear from me or hear from someone who does CARS and loves CARS and, they eat and breathe CARS, right? You actually get the opportunity to come in and put yourself on a pedestal and say, I'm not a CARS expert, but here's my best shot, right? You get to hear from other students that are struggling, right? And you're struggling and you get the support that you need live. And honestly, I think that when you're put in a situation where all eyes are on you, or in our workshops, all ears are on you, right? It's really easy to divert to what you're comfortable with and what your perspectives are. And the way that I see it, right? If you can come to a CARS workshop and volunteer to read aloud and tell us what the author is saying, right? You are able in that stressful scenario, right? Potentially, it's actually very fun, supportive atmosphere, right? But when you've got all ears on you and you're still able to separate yourself from this experience and focus on the author, there's nothing that the test day experience can throw at you that will trump that, right? So I love the way that our live sessions are structured for our course students, right? Because you get the opportunity to go through this with your peers and I like to think of us as like coaches, right? A coach that's helping you master these scientific objective strategies. But it's all practice in separating yourself from a situation and really engaging with someone who might have a different perspective than you. And like, as I said, I think that really does translate into medicine, and it's a skill that's hard to evaluate. But, keeping in mind, you're going to have to do CARS anyways, right? Try and recognize the things that CARS will do for you, so that every day when you do your daily CARS passage, right, you don't want to tear out your hair. You're like, thanks, CARS, for helping me develop really important social skills that will benefit me as a physician. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I love it. Safe. Yeah. The patient analogy is so valuable, right? It's all about being able to connect with that individual wherever they are in their life, right? I absolutely love that. And yeah. I know Azaii mentions that a lot in her free trial sessions as well. I love it.
That's something I think gets underestimated, because a lot of times, like, why do I need to know what my patient is feeling? And I know that, like, obviously, like, you should know, but I think a lot of times, like, students underestimate how important that is, right? Like, if you have, like, let's say you have a patient who is 17 and just got diagnosed with cancer, right? And you're like telling him we need to do surgery and chemo, and he says, like, oh, I won't be able to play basketball, will I? Coach Watkins and the guys are going to be upset. We're really hoping to go to state this year. Like, I don't mean to be like blasé and cold, but like, I don't care that this patient's coach's name is Coach Watkins. That doesn't matter to me, right? But he said Coach Watkins and the guys are going to be upset. That's a big deal, right? That puts off red flags. A lot of times students who get diagnosed with cancer feel like a burden to other people, and they feel guilty, right? Imagine that you're like a 17-year-old and you walk up to your friends, and every time you walk up to them, they get sad, right? Like, you would imagine, like, if somebody walks up and like they have cancer and every time you see them, you remember they have cancer, like, oh, it just kind of makes me sad. That person's going to feel like a burden. So a lot of times there's patients who like need rides to chemo because they feel sick, but they feel like a burden to everyone. So they don't want to ask for a ride. And so they don't ask for a ride. And so they skip some chemo appointments and then they die as a result. They die because they felt guilty. And if you as a physician can recognize like, hey, nobody's going to be upset with you for having cancer. As a matter of fact, like asking for help, like your friends and family want to help. They just feel like they can't sometimes. So if you ask them for help, that's actually going to like help them. Like they're going to be like, oh yes, anything I can do. Like I feel powerless at times. And so understanding kind of what's going on in other people's heads saves lives, right? And like that's a really important critical part of being a physician. And that's really what the CARS section is trying to test, right? It's not like, do you know all of the all the different names for these drugs, right? Pharmacology, but like this other part of medicine that I think gets kind of downplayed a little bit because we get so overwhelmed by all the different names for drugs. And so I think that's a really important thing to think about. And at least for me, that really helped me go from like, I hate CARS to like, I need to work on this. Like this is actually something that I cared about a little bit more all of a sudden when I started to realize, oh, this is actually important. I feel like there's a lot of people out there who talk about the MCAT and say like, oh, this is stupid. You don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about that. Like fluid dynamics. Like if you're going to be a cardiologist, yeah, you need to know fluid dynamics, right? Like why do you need to know about nuclear physics? If you're going to be a radiologist, absolutely you do. Oncology also, you got to be all over on that. So like understanding like how these things connect. And I think that's something that we do a lot in the course Azaii is like help students understand, at least in the sciences, I do this all the time, like why, like Poiseuille's law, the equation in fluid dynamics, that equation kills more people than any other equation because that explains cardiovascular disease, why a blockage reduces blood flow to different areas in your body. And so like understanding why that is and how that works, all of a sudden it makes it more interesting. And as a side note, that's also how the MCAT's going to test it. They're going to test it with application of things. Like they're not going to say like, oh, here's an equation, like plug in the variables. They're going to be like, oh, here's a whole passage about cardiology and like plaque in arteries and how that affects blood flow and how your body tries to fix this by raising blood pressure and why a blood thinner might help this. And going into all of that. And like that's how the MCAT tests it. So being able to understand how these things all connect is useful. And that's a way that you guys are not taught in undergrad. Like when's the last time your physics professor brought up the electron transport chain or your chemistry professor like brought up the kidney, right? But like that's actually like how the MCAT tests things is like putting those things together. And because you are trained in a way that is in these little boxes that are all separate, it's hard to deal with the MCAT because all of a sudden everything's getting blurred and shoved together and the stuff that you know about organic chemistry molecules also needs to somehow connect to hormones and also like metabolism and also like fluid dynamics, and figuring out all that can be really tricky, which is why the MCAT is a monster, and we all have job security because the MCAT is like it's so complex. And like that's like it's in a place that it kind of needs a lot of work to be able to just kind of deal with all of that. Yeah, I agree, Saif. I have, don't get me on my soapbox. I have some very strong feelings about the education system and how it should be changed and how it could be better. I wish my organic chemistry teacher talked about magnetic fields so I could understand how a mass spectrometer actually works and then talk about interpreting it. But yeah. So I think we had a couple other questions in here. So looking at this, I think we answered those questions. We did have a couple of other questions that were submitted. Ooh, skip past it. This is right up my alley. I feel like I'm just commandeering the group now. But I think understanding application is the important bit. Okay, I'm getting back on my soapbox. physics in undergrad, the problems, like the things that you have to overcome, like first off, memorize the equation, right? That's what you have to do first. Memorize the equation and then do the math, right? And so those are the two challenges you have in undergrad, right? With your undergrad physics stuff. So as long as you have the equations memorized and you can do the math, you're going to be fine. With the MCAT, it's more about knowing which equation you should be using. And there's so many equations, and like, how does capacitance relate to membranes of neurons, right? And like putting that stuff together. And so the challenge isn't knowing the equation, the challenge is knowing how to apply them, right? And then the challenge also isn't the math, because I know that a lot of students get kind of overwhelmed by the math on the MCAT, but the MCAT isn't a math test, right? They're not trying to figure out who's the best at math and let's make them do surgeries, right? Like that's not the goal of the AAMC. But they do need to know that you conceptually understand it. So there's not a lot of plug and chug, but there is a lot about like understanding relationships. And so if students are studying the MCAT the way that they studied for undergrad, where they're like memorizing the equations and just practicing on math, that doesn't help for the MCAT, because the MCAT has other challenges about like understanding like how to apply these things, how these things are related, right? How do magnetic fields affect like velocity of particles, which can then relate to fluid dynamics, right? Like how that is something I never got a lecture on, right? But like as long as I understand conceptually how these things work, then you're going to be okay. So for the MCAT, it's a lot more about concepts and relationships. MCAT should be above this. So for the MCAT, it's much more about like concepts and application and relationships. It's not about the math, and it's not purely about memorizing the equations. I would say about a third of the calculation questions on test day you can answer just by knowing units, by knowing like what's the relationship between a volt and a joule, or like a watt. What is that? Oh, that's just like energy over time. It's a joule per second, right? And so like figuring that out is a much more important part of this. And so a lot of times students study this like the way they used to, just like flashcarding equations. I don't think that's a good way to do it. This is why like in the course, I tend to focus more on like stories and applications of this. One, it's more interesting that way, right? To understand that sound waves can help with kidney stones, right? Like that's way more interesting. And that's about understanding like what is a sound wave? It's just stuff jiggling, right? And like if you have a crystal, you could jiggle it and it'll break apart, right? And like that's way more interesting than memorizing the equation for decibels, right? And so focusing on the relationships, I think that's big. It sticks with you, and it's just more interesting. And that's also how the MCAT's going to test it. It's also why, and I think this is why understanding the test writers is so important. Like with psychology, memorizing the definitions is not how you should do it. You should be about application, right? And like of the things. So like you don't just want to memorize the definition for schizotypal personality disorder, right? Schizotypal personality disorder is characterized by strange thought patterns and strange actions. Generally like speech patterns get involved in that as well, right? Like memorizing that definition is not nearly as interesting or useful as memorizing Yoda has schizotypal personality disorder. Like that's more interesting, so it sticks with you better. And two, that's how the MCAT's going to test it, is through application of this. And so if you spend more time focusing on those things, like the way that you're going to get tested, that helps a lot. And I think that especially for physics, that can be a problem for students, right? Where they get kind of like sucked in and try to study it the way that they had studied it before.
Yeah. And I feel like sometimes we punt to the podcast, but we did an episode that we talked about active studying versus passive studying. I would encourage you guys to check it out. Something else is study guides, review sheets. They are personally one of my favorite ways to go about studying. And again, I know we've talked about this in the past, and I'm sure you've talked about this in some of the science retrials and also in the course. But having a place where you've consolidated the information, and again, not just the facts, but also the relationships, putting review sheets together, like physically together, when you realize that there are connections. And so you can study them together, can be really, really game changing. And that was one of the things that I didn't know to do before I hadn't fully explored before I got into medical school. And once I got here, I had to learn in a very different way, because like you were talking about, Phil, the way you learn in undergrad is totally different. I was not a fan of physics because I basically had to relearn physics for the MCAT, which was frustrating. But when I got into medical school, right, the way I had to learn was different. The way I learn now is still different. And I still I would pull it out right now, but there'd be a lot of noise while I do it. But right now I'm making study review sheets. And when I'm, trying to keep track of all the bugs and all the illnesses that they cause, I'm not just going to put the bug and then the illness and then move on. I'm going to need to know the mechanism. I'm going to need to know the treatment, right? And so the symptoms. And so all of that is connection, and you want to have them in one place so you can study those things together. And so, recognizing that there are different, in the different science sections, there will be some overlap. There's going to be some overlap in the chem phys section and some overlap in the biochem section. And so really, like learning, that learning to learn, and also learning to make those connections and have them in a concrete place to come back to them to review can be super helpful as well.
Yeah. I love that learn to learn thing. Azaii, I know you and I have talked about this a lot, but I was not ready for med school when I went to med school. I also took the old MCAT because I am old. And so the old MCAT was very different than the new version of the MCAT, which is now 8 years old. But like this version of the MCAT is much more complex. And I think it's a much better diagnostic tool to figure out how people will do in med school. It's a lot harder, but like med school is really hard. I think that the MCAT is a really good way to help you like bridge that gap into medical school. And so I think that like this is something that we emphasize a lot, is like Azaii and I are not just teaching you guys just to do well in the MCAT. Like I want to teach you to do well in medical school. I want to teach you a way of approaching things that isn't just going to make you get a good score on the MCAT, but it's also going to make med school easier for you, because med school can be overwhelming and difficult. And as I know you've talked about that, and like I struggled, it's just difficult to kind of like make that transition. So if we can help with that, like we're all about it. And so that's why we approach some of the things in the courses the way that we do, is because we want to kind of like help shift the way that we're learning as well, rather than just like memorize all this stuff, right? Like there's a lot of companies that like print out a book and they're like, memorize this book, and then that's it, right? They're not teaching you how to approach content in order to get it to stick with you long term, right? That's also something different with medicine versus undergrad, right? Like if I have a test next week, I'll start studying next week, and then a month from now, I won't remember any of it. And that's okay, because that's how undergrad stuff works. That's how exams work. But imagine that same person is doing the same thing in med school and like, oh, I have a test next week. I'll start studying for it next week. And then a month from now, I won't know it anymore. That's scary, right? Like a physician who like learned everything they learned in order to pass all the tests, but then 2 years out of med school, they don't remember any of it. Like, I don't want that person as my doctor, right? Like I want them to make sure that what they're learning is sticking with them and being retained. And so kind of changing the way that we're looking at stuff, I think has a big effect in that. Yeah. So a couple of questions. Christian, I have a question about the MCAT Science sections. How do we go about interpreting passage diagrams? So Christian, are you on the course? I just uploaded a video in the last month about data interpretation, going into a lot of that. I do think the data interpretation is like we talked about, cars had a lot of skill. There are skills in the sciences, and that's where a lot of the data interpretation comes in. And so there are some things kind of there that I would advocate for. Do the 5-day free trial. Thank you for bringing that up. Like if any of you guys are not on the course, hop in there and take a look at this. The lecture on data interpretation is, I think, in the latter half of the course because there's a lot of content to begin with. But I also think that like Azaii is saying, reviewing is useful. That's why we make videos for all the AMC stuff, right? So that you can go through the AMC and like understand, how am I supposed to think about this? How am I supposed to approach this? That's also just side note. That's another thing that you guys are not prepared well for. It's honestly, it's a little unfair that in undergrad, they don't really teach you guys data interpretation. Like I read like 2 journal articles total in undergrad and I got a biology degree. And then all of a sudden, like in order to be a good physician, you need to do data interpretation. Like that's a core part of this, being a physician. Whenever I get together and like talk to my friends who are physicians through like Zoom calls, and like something always comes up every week where it's like, hey, have you guys read this new thing about like how COVID is affecting pregnancy? And like everyone's like, yeah, I just read that. And like somebody like, no, I didn't read it. Like, what's going on with that? And like, you send me that article. And like physicians, like it isn't you just finish med school and then you never have to use data interpretation. That's a lot of being a physician. They don't have time to teach you that in med school. And I know some of you guys might be like, well, they should. I think Azaii will back me up on this. There's not a lot of free time in med school for them to add material for you to learn and study. And so you aren't getting taught this in undergrad. They kind of don't have the time to teach you in med school, and you have to know it as a physician. So like, where do they make that work? So they throw it all into the MCAT. And like I said, it's a little unfair, but it is important. And so that's why like going to the workshops is useful. It's why this review is important. But if you're struggling with that, Christian, that means that you are human, who is going through this process of trying to get into med school, because that is something that pretty much every student struggles with, unless they have a PhD in biochemistry and have been doing research for a decade, and then they're probably already good at data interpretation. So, so I think that's the, I about to say that's the short version. I don't know how short that is. But yeah, I would take a look at that and note that data interpretation is a big part of it. And there's a lot of stuff in the course designed to help with that.
So we had a question in the chat about, and specifically for me, but I actually think it might be useful to hear from Nicole and Seyda first about what, how, and Phil, you can also chime in, how we studied and what our timelines looked like. But I think it would be helpful to hear what perhaps they should have looked like, and then we can learn from where we could have improved in our own timelines.
So the MCAT timeline is going to vary for all of you. Looking on one end at the MCAT timeline and on the other end, the timeline of other commitments that you have going on in life simultaneously. As Seyda mentioned earlier, a lot of you may be applying to school, and at the same time, you may be an undergrad, you may have a job, you may be, like she said, doing those altruistic duties of A, out of the goodness of your heart, B, building your application, you may be in a research lab, you may be getting clinical experiences. So all of the different factors that will impact the exact timeline in which you're able to prepare, whether you are preparing on a full-time load or part-time load. I'm going to stray away or pass it on to Seyda to kind of go into some of those logistics, that timeline. And it's also going to depend on if you're preparing your timeline during the application season, or if you've completed the MCAT a little bit earlier. So if you've navigated your MCAT process a little earlier in terms of, finishing everything in January, that gives a little bit more flexibility than if you're looking at it for maybe March, because that can overlap with the application as a whole. For the application primary apps, I usually suggest around 4 to 5 months to be able to prepare. Between the personal statement, the experiences, going selection process and aligning that with your MCAT, GPA school preferences, and then communicating with your letter writers and trying to get those letters and sometimes even drafting components for them or giving them your background. All that will go into your overall timeline. So in terms of the admissions timeline, usually for that prep process, 4 to 5 months is a pretty decent time period. And then how the MCAT gets incorporated into that, I'm going to let Seyda jump in for that. So they kind of work in conjunction for the two.
Yes, thank you for touching on that, Nicole. And I think MCAT is so multifaceted. So we need to just be really aware of that first. Because your background, again, if you've taken these classes recently, or maybe it's been 4 to 5 years, is going to significantly vary and determine how long it's going to take you to prepare for this exam. And something that I really just love talking to my students about and just being really raw and straightforward is that there's no point of applying if we can't have that MCAT score. And so because it's so difficult to give such vague advice, as everyone is on a very different journey, I highly advise, as I drop that link into regarding meeting with our advisors, set up a time to speak to one of our experts, as they're going to provide the most personalized guidance regarding where you need to go, how long it's going to take you, and more importantly, we are here to support you, right? We're here to hold your hand. It's not just about, let's just start studying for the MCAT, because if you're not doing well, your MCAT's not going to do well. And so we really do take a holistic approach regarding this into, I'm so sorry, right? It's such a long-winded answer for such something that you would want a short answer to, but it is so much more complex than that. And again, Phil mentioned this again as well earlier, that it's going to be determined by what your goal is and where you're at right now. And so for that reason, I did get a question earlier, Azaii and Phil, I know you guys are going to go into this. So could you also touch on motivation? Because I know you guys love talking about this on your podcast, and I'm just going to hand it over to you two.
I don't mind starting this.
Go for it.
So I'll answer the question first about timeline and then motivation, because I am here for this. So timeline, I initially wanted to be a September test taker to get it off of my plate and be able to just focus on classes, because I was a full-time student and also had a part-time job TAing multiple classes. And so that didn't work out because I did not put the effort that I needed to put into it. I was working in a research lab during that summer, and yeah, that did not go well. I definitely was a lot more focused on that. I found it more interesting. So I ended up just saying, okay, I will test in in January, because I knew that, okay, if I test in January, if I need to reschedule, I can reschedule in peace. And in September, I was like, well, I couldn't test this month. I'll start dabbling. And then I dabbled. I did not really dive in. Come October, I started feeling a little bit more pressure, and I'm like, all right, I'll start studying for the MCAT a little bit more. And then as it got closer, I just kind of kept ramping it up. I was blessed enough to have a biochem professor, a bio set of professors. I was a non-traditional student, so we had a track at U Chicago for non-bio pre-meds that really helped and prepared me. So for the biochem sections, it was fresh, and I felt stronger in those areas. Like I mentioned, physics, I was starting from scratch. So I definitely spent a lot more time on that at the beginning. I didn't have a clear strategy when I went into it. I bought books and I ended up not using them. It was just not a good fit for me. I ended up doing a lot of videos and having to try a lot of different things out. I eventually realized that, taking notes, but also keeping track of what I needed to work on was going to be helpful for me, and looking at that data. And that took me some time. I've shared this before. A couple of weeks before my test day, I took a practice exam that destroyed my confidence. I went down by double-digit percentile points, and it was intense. I bawled. I called my mama. She is my number one fan. I was like, I don't know if I can take this exam. I don't know what happened. I'm freaking out. I think it was like 2 weeks out. It was terrifying. And when I went back to look at it, it really was a complete, I did not use the strategies that I had started building up. I was relying too much on content. It just fell apart. I ended up pulling myself up by my bootstraps, really honing in on that. And, I was able to get back to where I had been and able to do well in the actual MCAT. So that's a little bit about my trajectory. Motivation. Y'all, I already told you that, I considered leaving medical school this year on more than one occasion. And there are times where even now it's just like, okay, this is not easy. And I think you don't hear that enough. It's not going to be easy, which is why why preparing now and using the MCAT as an opportunity to make the transition easier will make your life easier. But one of the things that I do now is self-care days. And when I was taking my shelf exams at the very beginning of last year, I wasn't good about that, even though I shared with my students for years to make sure that they were taking care of themselves. I wasn't the best at taking my own advice with that. And I burnt out and I had to step back and say, okay, what is going to be important for me? Which is why Molly and I shared in the chat, take a day off every week. You need to make sure that you're not going to burn yourself out, reminding yourself why you're doing it. One of the things that I did, I think it was a few months ago, is I wrote on index cards, and I have taped these index cards to my desk. I wrote my motivation on this. And one of the things that, is on here, and I can read some of them because I can see some of them underneath what I have, was your future patients are counting on you. Don't jeopardize your calling and purpose due to laziness. And with respect to, oh yeah, that's on there. With respect to work and making sure that, I don't just appreciate and love what I get to do in the moment. It was, you're impacting future doctors, get on it, no excuses. And that helps me when, I'm studying in classes and I'm not thinking about, okay, how is this going to translate to what I do elsewhere? And so those are all different things that I can, use to stay motivated. With patient education, which is one of my absolute joys, I think back to conversations I've had with patients, had a patient who had diabetes for years and didn't know to check their feet every day because they had peripheral neuropathy. And if they step on something, they may not realize they stepped on something. Now they have an infection that's going to get worse and worse, right? I think about my grandmother who had multiple medical conditions for years, lived in New Jersey, very minimal English. And it wasn't until she moved back to Puerto Rico and had physicians who spoke her language that she was finally able to start understanding her medical conditions. And even now she'll call me and she'll say, what's this medication for? What am I supposed to be doing? She has diabetes and she mentioned something the other day about her eyes. I was like, Abuelita, you're going to the eye doctor now. If I have to, I will call one of my uncles and be like, let's get this done. And having that why and making sure that why is not just one thing, making sure that why encompasses a lot of things, that is multifaceted, is going to be huge for your motivation. And also keeping track of your progress. Little bits of progress are motivation because you see it. And a lot of times we're waiting to see that huge jump at one point in time. That's not how this works. That's not how the MCAT works. That's not how med school works. That's not how lifelong learning works. And Phil, I'll let you talk because I feel like I've gone on a tangent and I could keep talking for hours about this.
No, I love it. I think we've talked earlier about this. I love listening to anybody talk who is passionate about whatever it is they're talking about. And that is very clearly coming through. Yeah, two things. And you hit the nail on the head. Like the two things that kept me motivated are, one, like remembering why I'm doing it, right? And all of your like flashcard stuff and your abuelita and all of that stuff, like that really comes down to like, remember that the reason I'm doing this is not because I just want a higher MCAT score. Like the reason I'm doing this is not just because I love studying and I want to spend my life studying. The reason you're doing this is to help people. And that kept me motivated. I worked as a transporter in a hospital. And whenever I like got really down, I'm like, I'm really not enjoying like studying Bernoulli's equation and like using it. All of a sudden I'll go and like work at the hospital. And afterwards I'm like, yeah, okay, I remember why I'm doing this, right? Like there's a reason at the end of this, and it's not just studying. And so that's, I think, big. The other thing that you mentioned, Azaii, which is watching your progress. So many times students focus on the end goal and just look at that, right? Versus rather than kind of like watching their progress. I like to use this analogy of like, let's say you wanted to be a bodybuilder. Like I want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger at his peak, right? And like, so I'm going to go and I'm going to, yeah, exactly, Seyda, gains. I'm going to get swole, right? And so I'm going to go exercise. And if that's the only thing I think about is like, I want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I want to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Honestly, at this point, I'd settle for where Arnold Schwarzenegger is right now. Would probably be a better shape than where I am at this moment. But like, if that's how I'm thinking about this, and then I look in the mirror, I'm like, not there, right? And if I do that every day for 3 months, for 4 months, and I'm like going to the gym and my arms hurt, but I'm not at the thing that I'm trying to do, like you start to get down on yourself, right? Because you're so focused on like your end goal and I'm not there. And every time I look in the mirror, I'm reminded that I'm not there, even though I'm trying so hard. It's a lot better if you can like watch like, hey, my bench press went up. Hey, my pants fit better, right? Hey, I went down a belt loop, right? Like that's like those little pieces of progress. Like if you focus on that, like celebrate the little bit that you did, right? Celebrate, I understand magnets. I didn't understand magnets, but now I understand magnets, right? Like that's a big deal. Right? Like magnets are pretty much magic. So if you understand how they work, then that's something to, pat yourself on the back for. And so taking a moment and doing that is, I think, useful. Azaii, I know that you love flashcards, like physical flashcards like I did. And so in med school, like I loved seeing my stack of flashcards. She's got them handy, of course. I love watching my stack of flashcards get bigger. And so every time I finished a test, I like take whatever flashcards I made for that and add them to the stack. And eventually you get to the point where like my flashcards are not measured in inches, they're measured in feet, right? And like it feels so good to look at this and being like, yeah, like I have learned a lot, right? And that feels good, and that's way more motivating than I am years from being a doctor, right? Like if you just keep focusing on that, like that is going to like demotivate you. And so kind of like thinking about the progress that you're making and watching that progress and realizing what your final goal is, and like it's not just to study, it's become a physician, right? To help people, to, whatever your big motivating factor is. I know I've talked about this a lot, but my big motivating factor is I wanted to teach at med schools. I love education more than medicine. I'll be honest about that. And that's why I do this, right? That's why I did this in medical school, right? Like I worked in teaching, not because I had tons of free time, but because that's what I loved doing. And I loved learning so that I could pass on information. And that's like the big cardinal trait of mine too. That's actually an MCAT term there for those of you. My big cardinal trait is I love to learn things and spread knowledge. And those are the things that I care about. And so like those sorts of things kept me motivated even when I was in med school. So remembering your why, trying to figure out what it is that motivates you. And remember, it's not the process necessarily that you love, but still like be proud of the progress you've made in that process as you're going through that. So hopefully that makes sense. Keep track of the process you've been making. Yeah, exactly, Safe. Yeah, and that also comes in handy for like personal statement. Yeah, thinking about your motivation. And then after you write parts of your personal statement, be like, yeah, I did a good job. I got something done. I think that's also really big. I know that there was another question that a student submitted, which this was maybe a little bit more Nicole for admission stuff about like how will medical schools view clinical experience committed or completed just the year of the application? Is that a problem? Also, do you do mock interviews and give interview tips and tricks?
Of course, yes. So experiences are a huge part of applying to medicine. And one of the reasons why you want clinical experience is so that you're able to interact with those patients directly and really see, is medicine something I enjoy? Like conceptually, it may be something that lines up for you, but interacting with patients one-on-one as a transporter, as an EMT, EMS, through volunteering at a hospital or at a hospice. These are all great ways to be able to make sure that in practice you enjoy working with patients. And that's something that medical schools want to see. And clinical experience, there are a ton of hours that are needed by medical school. And as long as you're really able to achieve the hours before applying, it's pretty fair game. I mean, usually if you're looking to achieve like around, let's say 500 hours of clinical experience, just to put you in the ballpark of what would open doors for you, you would want to begin and have experience for about a year. So even if you're starting that, let's say your junior year, if you're going to take a gap year, that's totally okay because you'll be able to achieve that as long as doing things before that to move you closer to your goal. So let's say you were studying for the MCAT before. Let's say you were doing research before. Let's say you were a TA and you were volunteering in different community centers. Those are all that strengthen who you are as an applicant. So in lieu of the patient experience that's come later, but still came before the application, it's all going to make you a more well-rounded individual and applicant as a whole. So in terms of, when you're obtaining the experiences, really as long as it's coming before you apply, it's still valuable. But remember, you don't want those few hundred hours of clinical to be the only thing on your application. And that's where they'll see that there's a contribution in many different areas that have allowed you to be really a holistic individual. We've seen a lot of students over the years that are non-traditional. Engineering is one of those common routes that's come around. Like a lot of students were ending their few years in college and then they realized, you know what, I actually want to take the route of medicine. And they had done a ton of research in the field of engineering and then had gone into research a little bit more in the sciences and realized patients are missing and human interaction is missing. And we see those students transition in that senior year or in that junior year, depending on when they're applying, and obtaining clinical experiences at that time. So again, completely reasonable, just making sure that it aligns with your story. And this is where it all comes hand in hand with your personal statement, your experience descriptions. All of it goes into who you are. You may not have started that clinical exposure early, but your other life experiences may have been what got you to the point of pursuing a career in medicine and what got you to want to be this physician now. And so it's really looking at that picture and then also understanding that the mock interviews and interviews themselves are a great way to be able to identify these experiences and build on maybe the why that you started them a little bit later or the other commitments that came in first, and telling your full story like that and having the freedom to do so. And yes, here at Jack Westin, we do provide support with mock interviews. It's a great service that you're able to obtain, and you're more than welcome to meet with one of the academic advisors for more information on that or general information. But clinical experiences, it's okay to obtain it in that last year. But again, make sure overall you're just thinking about a well-rounded applicant. And from the start, you're constantly doing things to build up who you are. And one more thing to note about experiences is I do want to have your core experience hours done by the time you submit your application. You can also continue preparing experiences after the primary application is submitted. And that can also be shared in the application at different phases. So there's always room to also continue growing throughout the application process as well. And again, make sure you're pursuing experiences that really fulfill you, your why of why you're becoming a physician, because anything that puts you in a position of passion will allow your power to come out of a future med student.
Amazing. Oh my goodness. It was so great to hear all of our experts today. And the fact that each and every one of you made some time out of your busy schedules. We really appreciate that. Again, if you were here today and your question wasn't answered, please schedule a time with this link right here to meet with our advisors to discuss the next steps in your personal journey to really ensure that you accomplish your dream of becoming a doctor, right? We have our team of experts who are working day in and day out to ensure your success. Again, thank you so much for everyone being here tonight. We are going to wrap up because our experts certainly have lots on their plate. We need to prepare more MCAT and admissions material so that we can get you into medical school. So thank you so much for everyone being here. And again, meet with our advisors if you have any questions. All right, everyone, have a great weekend and have a great night.
Good evening, everybody. Have a good weekend. Happy New Year also. Look at this. This is the new year of this is going to be a big year for you guys. I'm excited for you. Like I actually am. All the students I've been talking to, like, this is going to be a big year. Finishing the MCAT, applying, getting into med school by the end of the year. Super awesome.
We're really excited to be here, and we're glad that you guys found this helpful. I always say this, but it is the weekend. Don't forget to take care of yourself. This is the perfect opportunity for some R&R, and make sure that you're actually getting rest, because rest is important for memory. I'm sure, Phil, you can attest to this. But thank you guys for coming today. It was our pleasure.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and thank you for trusting us with your pre-med process. We know that it's a really difficult journey, and we want to be here as your cheerleaders behind you in every way that we can be. And we're happy to be on your side. And please don't hesitate to share your stories of success either. We like seeing all of you hit that goal. We're here with you through the process, and we want to see what happens on the end, and looking forward to being there all throughout as well.
I love that, Timothy. What's R&R? I feel like you're going to be a surgeon. What's rest and relaxation? I don't know what that is. I have a couple friends who are surgeons, and I feel like they have that. No, that's fine, Timothy. Yeah. I just thought, like, ooh, that's something I feel like I've heard from some friends. What's rest and relaxation? All right. You guys all have a wonderful evening. We will see you around.